All right, you can start.
Okay, are you going to introduce me or just launch
We did already. You didn't hear us.
Oh, okay. I've just been sitting here in a dark corner. All right. Good evening. Apparently, as you've been warned, I'm Jon Zawislak with the University of Arkansas, and happy to be able to come and visit with y'all tonight. I'm going to talk to y'all a little bit about drones. You know, honeybees, of course, are fascinating creatures. None of us beekeepers would argue that, and I think drones are no exception. From their birth to their dramatic, sexy death, or sometimes their quiet disappearance, their anonymous mass eviction from a fall hive, they just live out their lives and they do their job that they've been assigned really without question, just like their female counterparts. They're no less important. But beekeepers don't really appreciate the tireless efforts of the drone most of the time, and so maybe we should. So we're going to talk a little bit about what drones do and maybe why we should care about them just a little bit more. You know, traditionally people have considered drones to just be lazy, worthless, unproductive moochers of the bee world. But without drones, of course, there would be no more honeybees and there'd be no more honey. So are they really unimportant, or maybe we just don't understand their importance? You know, they're doing their assigned part, just playing the cards they were dealt with that vital role in reproduction. Their part that they play might seem very brief, but their impact on the colony success is very enormous. And for them, of course, what they do is a full-time job, and they really work as hard as the worker bees. Along with the queen, they ensure the continuity of the genetic future of a honeybee colony and the honeybees as a species. But they are really out there winging it, trying to do that job just about every single day. And their lifespan for doing so is actually a little bit longer than that of a forager. You know, drone bees historically and their activities have really been misunderstood. There's been a lot of misconceptions. Perhaps understandably so, since the main activities of the drones occur far away and out of sight. The queen bee was actually called the king bee by ancient natural philosophers. You can insert your criticism of patriarchal societies here, but that's just what they thought. And then eventually, of course, they realized that those bees were laying eggs. They established that they were actually female. Then they thought maybe drones just wandered around the hive, fertilizing eggs in the comb, similar to fish and frogs and other creatures. So it was a logical step. But you know, mating was never observed in the hive, and so it wasn't something that beekeepers would have been aware of. Some of our understanding of honeybees and drones started to change in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, thanks to the work of some people like François Huber. He was a Swiss entomologist and a beekeeper from a somewhat wealthy family, part of the leisure class of his day. So he had time to be idle with his honeybees and consider many of the fascinating aspects of them, as we would probably all like to do. But Huber began losing his sight at a very early age, about 15, and he became nearly blind. He never went completely blind. He could make out vague shapes and see light and shadow, and he could actually get around. And a lot of people around him actually didn't know that he was nearly blind, because he would face people talking to him, and he could move around a little bit. But he would have other people, particularly his wife and some of his servants, read to him from the literature that was available in his day. And so it gave him plenty of time to consider what he thought and some of the gaps in the knowledge, things that didn't make sense. And so he had other people observe his bees. His wife and his servant would describe what they saw, and then he would ask them questions, direct their observations about what they were seeing, and he would think about it in more detail and try to figure some different things out. he actually discovered a number of things, or at least he was the first to really report a number of things about honeybees. He invented what he called the book hive. This was a series of wooden frames that held one comb each, and they could be opened on either side to take a look and see what the bees were doing. It was really the first observation hive. It didn't have any glass in it, but you could kind of fold it out and see what was going on. And he actually published about 3 volumes of his observations on honeybees in the early 19th century. And you can still read them today. Michael Bush has republished them. They're available also on his website, which I'll have here on the screen. And Michael actually built a model of his hive, and you can see photographs of that and kind of see how it would have worked. Huber, he also described the detailed mathematical geometry of honeycombs and comb building, and how bees went about doing that. He was actually the first person to describe wax production and determine that wax was produced from wax glands. In the past, people had questioned where wax came from. They thought bees actually collected wax from flowers and brought it back and reshaped it. And kind of in a way they do, as Huber discovered, wax was produced by bees consuming a whole lot of carbohydrates. So they're gathering the nectar, and indirectly they're gathering wax. But he was also the first person to observe that bees were circulating air in the hive by fanning their wings. And he explained the origin of propolis inside the hive by observing bees bringing it in and spreading it around, and surmised what it might be. Of course, we all like that stuff that gums up the works. He also experimented quite a bit, or directed his servant to do some experiments and explain the observations to him. But he discovered that drones do not fertilize eggs inside of the cells. And he was the first to actually confirm that a virgin queen had to leave the hive, and then she returned before she could fertilize or produce fertilized eggs. And she returned with a mating sign or a mating plug, which we now know is the contribution of the drone that is left behind after that mating. We fast forward to the 20th century in Germany. The Konigers were a couple of German scientists, a married couple, that did bee research for over 30 years. And they did some wonderful experiments up in the Bavarian Alps. They had access to these humongous alpine valleys that were carved out by glaciers. They had very high, steep walls. They were miles long and full of wildflowers, but no trees, and they had no natural honeybees. So they could come in and set up beehives in very specific locations and in different arrangements, and they could study the bees and the different flights that they made, and they designed a lot of really elegant experiments around drone congregation areas and mating behavior for many years. And a lot of their research was published in scientific journals in German, but a lot of it was collected and it was put together into this book here. It was translated into English and edited together by Jamie Ellis and Larry Connor. So that's available for anyone. And a lot of the information that we have about mating biology of honeybees is kind of summarized in this book. So there's a lot of great stuff in here, and I've used them as a good source in the talk we have tonight. So that's a great book. I highly recommend if you're interested in that. Of course, we all know that drones develop from unfertilized eggs, and the workers develop from fertilized eggs. This is called haplodiploidy sex determination, which is a long word for what seems like a very simple fact. It's not unique to bees. It happens in other Hymenoptera. It actually happens in varroa mites as well, and a number of other insects, and I think maybe even some other higher animals. So it's not just insects. If you want to know more about that, I actually have a video. You can snap a picture of that code there, about a 15-minute video that really delves into some of the genetics of honeybees and discusses really what haplodiploidy sex determination is. We know that it takes a little bit longer for drones to develop than workers. So workers take 21 days, but drones take about 24 days to develop. And once they hatch out of their cells, they need about 12 more days to reach their sexual maturity. And during that time, they go through several different stages of behavior. They will actually remain in the brood nest for about 7 days. They're fed by worker bees. They can't even feed themselves, and they kind of wander around, and they stay close to where they were born, and they're essentially taken care of. After about a week, then they start to wander around. They will take short cleansing flights outside of the hive, usually no more than 2 to 3 minutes apiece. And then they will also explore some of the honeycombs, and they'll begin to actually feed themselves from honey cells. So once they get to be big boys, they start to venture out a little bit more, wander around the house. And then around 2 weeks old, drones will start taking their mating flights. So they still will be taking short flights, just a few minutes, cleansing flights, but they'll start to take longer flights that can last 15, 20, 25 minutes. And they typically take off on sunny afternoons when the temperatures are at least about 64 degrees Fahrenheit. On warmer summer days, flights began earlier and continue later in the day. But in the springtime, this chart here shows some of the times centered around about 3:30 in the afternoon, where this study was conducted, and I believe it was in Europe. But so, depending on where we live, this is going to vary a little bit. But this is in the spring, and in the summer, that's kind of spread out a little bit earlier as well as a little bit later. They don't like really windy days, so if the wind is over about 18 miles an hour, then they just stay home. A drone flight lasts about 20 to 25 minutes, and that is based on the amount of honey that they can store in their crop, their fuel tank. So they need energy to fly just like any other bee, and so they gas up before they go. They have to rest and feed, so they return to the hive after about that 20-25 minutes to do that, and they may make multiple flights during the day. On average, about 3 to 6 flights. So they'll be coming and going for a little while. And they will spend about 10 to 14 days taking these flights. And so you can see over here on the right, what these charts are showing is kind of the length of time it takes for them to take those flights, and it varies according to the temperature and how many flights they make. So in the summertime, they accumulate by taking an hour to about 2.5 hours of flight per day. They all accumulate around 21 hours of flight time in their lives. So in the summertime, when it's warmer, they start earlier, they stay out later, they accumulate that lifetime of flight a little faster than they do in the spring. But like worker bees, they've really only got so many miles in them. So they can accumulate between 150 to a little over 500 miles of flight in the course of their entire lives. And their wings just simply wear out, just like worker bees. They've got no more than about 500-mile warranty on those things, and once they're just shredded from flapping 200 times a second, then it just takes an enormous amount of energy to stay in the air, and they're slower, so they are more prone to predation by birds and dragonflies and other predators, and they may simply fly out one day and not make it home. Drones can fly up to 3 miles. We kind of talk about that 3-mile limit for worker bees. Drones can get that far as well, but they don't usually. Most of them tend to stay within a half a mile to about 3/4 of a mile from home. And the reason they do this is efficiency. Because they're making multiple flights per day, it takes them time to get out from the hive, and they're basically going to be burning a lot of fuel. They can fly a half a mile in just under 3 minutes, and they'll need another 3 minutes to get home. So that's 6 minutes out of their We said up to 25 minutes of flight time, so that leaves them 9 minutes to cruise around a drone congregation area looking for a queen and hopefully acquiring that one goal that all the drones have. If they were to fly farther from home, which some of them do, a small proportion of them do go, even as you see here, they've been trapped. They trapped marked drones away from the hive and congregation areas, and they can determine where they came from. And you'll see that some of them do go up to 2 miles away, but that's down here around 5 to 10%. So most of them do stay very close to the hive. But the closer they have, then the more time they have to just simply cruise around. If you watch your entrance, your hive entrance, then you may observe that the drones are grooming themselves. They're wiping their face and antennas before they head out, because they got to look good in order to be able to attract that queen. But they're probably actually cleaning off their antenna. It's like washing your windshield before you go out on a drive. You want to make sure you can see well, and the drones want to make sure that they can smell that queen that they're going to have to find in flight and hit that moving target that's a little dot in the sky. So they want to get all their equipment in well-tuned condition before they take off. Interesting thing about drone congregation areas is that they occur at the same locations every year. And this happens even though this year's drones are all long gone before next year's drones venture out. And queens also know how to locate drone congregation areas. It's still kind of mysterious exactly how they do that and all the things that they're looking for, but we do have some ideas. It takes over 2,000 drones usually to establish and maintain a drone congregation area. About 5,000 to 10,000 or more is very stable. Fewer than that, and sometimes the DCAs just simply become abandoned. The bees need a sufficient number to be present at any given time, while others are heading back and forth to the hive. You need to have a lot of them there circling around. It creates a pheromone cloud that attracts other drones to the area, but also helps to attract a queen. And so ideally, we need a ratio of at least 2,000 drones per potential queen in the area to maintain a congregation area. They occur about 15 to 200 feet above the ground. And different races of bees, it's been found, tend to be more abundant at different altitudes. Italian drones, for instance, typically are lower down, around 12 to 15 feet while above the ground, while Carniolan drones are more abundant around 60 feet above the ground. And Italian and Carniolan queens also tend to approach the congregation areas at similar altitudes. So this actually increases the probability that they would mate with those of their own race. There's also a lot of overlap. Drones are constantly circling up and down, but just the way it kind of averages out, they tend to congregate at certain altitudes, but they definitely do mix and mingle, and the queens do that as well. As I said, a congregation area can contain up to 10,000 or more drones, and it seems that what they look for is a bright, evenly lit sky with kind of a dip in the horizon. So where there's any mountainous terrains or a break in the trees, so that there is a big patch of clear blue sky that they can see. And perhaps this helps them to be able to spot queen bee flying through a little bit easier than they would be if it was, up against the shadow of mountains or trees and other things. In flat, even areas out on savannas and plains and prairies, the drones tend to be just a little bit more evenly distributed across the landscape. They just kind of head out and cruise around at certain distances from the hive, and every drone just hopes for the best. If a queen bee does come along, then they quickly congregate wherever queen pheromone is detected. These drone congregation areas can collect drones from multiple colonies and multiple apiaries. up to 250 different colonies. Drones from 250 different colonies have been recorded in a single drone congregation area. While they can fly up to several miles away, they typically stay less than or closer than about 3/4 of a mile, as I said, for efficiency. And they typically will visit the nearest drone congregation area to their hive. And of course, queens can fly a little bit farther away. The queens will fly up to 2 miles away, but they will typically also just go over a little over half a mile to a mile. And this, of course, limits their contact with their own brothers. It's a dangerous occupation to be a queen bee, leaving the hive and flying a mile away and coming back and making repeated flights exposes her to predation, to getting lost, to changes in the weather. Lots of different things can happen to that young queen who has never really been out in the world before. And there's about a 25% chance that she's not coming back, according to the Koeniger's research. They based that number on 30 years of record keeping at all of their research stations in Germany. And they determined that each queen has about a 75% success rate. So if you've ever been waiting for a hive to requeen itself, you've seen queen cells, you've seen queen cells that were chewed open and clearly the queen had emerged, and you wait and there's nobody laying eggs, it's entirely possible that they did rear a queen, but she went out and simply did not come back. So that's why we have to keep an eye on things and intervene sometimes. The reason that the queen flies farther than the drones is to reduce inbreeding. She takes longer flights because it reduces the probability of mating with one of her own brothers. But as we saw, there is still some overlap. There's still some possibility that her brothers are still going to be within that range that she's flying. But because she is mating with multiple drones, then it reduces the probability of any effects of inbreeding are going to be very high. So the more drones she mates with, then the effects of any one individual is going to be lessened. So while it's still possible, we lower our chances of that. Which does beg the question, how many times does a queen bee mate? And of course, that varies considerably from queen to queen and hive to hive. The best guesses that we have, this was researched by David Tarpey at North Carolina, and he actually dissected hundreds of queens and was able to look at the genetics of the contents of the spermatheca and determine how many times that queen had mated with different drones. And the average was about 15, or 14.6 is what he found, about 15. And you can see that some mated one time. There's one that came in around 59. The average is about 15, but the most common was actually around 10. So the more drone fathers that there are in a hive, we have more genetic diversity. And so that's considered a good thing for the bees. We have more different combinations of genes, so we've got more chances to overcome any potential problems. There's always a bee that can take care of a job. And the more drones we have, of course, then the smaller proportion of the entire hive is fathered by any one particular drone. So this is the genetic diversity goes up, but you kind of reach a maximum return of the benefits of that, because it's still a lot of dangers involved with the queen who's going out on all these mating flights. And so if she keeps doing that repeatedly, there's a greater chance that she's not going to make it back. So after about 10 mating with about 10 drones, then you start to get diminishing returns for the benefit that polyandry is going to help out with fitness. So different combinations of genes do impart varying levels of specialty. some bees are simply going to be really good at house cleaning. Others at guarding and nursing, foraging, and maintaining temperature. Those last two there, disease resistance and parasite tolerance, are two traits that, of course, we're really interested in today for mites and diseases. And if we can get more bees into the gene pool that carry diseases for these two things, or genes for resistance to these two things, then of course that's going to improve our honeybees overall. So that's something that a lot of breeders are actually working towards. And the research that has come out, I mentioned this a minute ago, shows that about 10 matings is kind of where the cutoff is for the benefit. Anything over that is kind of overkill, and it doesn't make a significant contribution to the fitness of the colony. So when a queen goes out on a mating flight, of course, presumably there are plenty of drones out there in the drone congregation area. And as she approaches, the drones will give chase, and our queen plays hard to get. They form what's called a drone comet, and she circles around for a little while, and this really sorts the drones out, and eventually one catches up. He uses his nice, clean, tidy antennae to determine that, yes, this indeed is a receptive queen bee and not just some stray thing that flew by. And when he catches up, he grabs hold and assumes the appropriate position. And when he's in place, he actually lets go. And this all takes about 1 second. He lets go, and his concentration is completely elsewhere at this time. He stops flapping his wings, and the queen actually carries him in flight. And as he flips over backwards, it forces about half of his bodily fluids into his genitalia, and he completes the mating act. And of course, snap, crackle, pop. That's about it for him. He falls to the ground. The queen, that look on her face says it all there. She just kind of shrugs it off and flies on. Immediately, as soon as that drone is out of the way, his buddies have started closing in, and they are going to try to take their turn. And they have the added challenge of removing the mating plug or the mating sign in order to get down to business. And the queen will, of course, do this several times in one flight, and she may return for multiple flights over the course of several days, depending on her inclination and the weather and other factors. When that queen enters that drone congregation area and they start to form that drone comet, the drones are actually getting sorted. So this is an important step. Your fast flyers get up toward the front of the pack. Your smaller, weaker drones trailing off towards the rear, probably shouting things like, hey, you guys, wait up. This is very similar to another race that occurs regularly in mammals and other animals. It promotes the fittest for the future. So the strongest, fastest swimmer wins that race. And so essentially the drones are being sorted in the same way. Mating competition is very common all over the animal kingdom, humans included. Lots of insects, birds, mammals, many things. So it actually got me thinking when I was preparing for this talk. When we do artificial insemination or instrumental insemination, how do we select our drones? Presumably the fastest, strongest ones are out in the drone congregation areas. And when we're collecting drones, very often we screen off the front of the hive to collect those that are returning. But, honestly, those could be the losers. Those could be the wimpy, slow drones that didn't make it. And so they return back to the hive to get a snack and try again. So when we are selecting drones, we're bypassing this portion of natural selection that's going on in the air. And we may not be taking the strongest drones. I'm not sure there's any way around that, but it's just something to consider. Not trying to criticize anyone's technique, but it just made me wonder what the effect might be over many successive generations. Maybe there's not a right or wrong answer, but Maybe it doesn't make any difference, but it was just something that I thought might be worth considering. This is a scene from a film called More Than Honey, which had some amazing footage. There's a queen bee on flight, a bunch of drones that are closing in on her. There's the drone Comet, and there you see a drone doing his best to keep up with that queen in flight. And a little mating competition there, and they're going to regroup and try again. And it looks like he is the lucky one. In a second, when he's ready, he'll stop flying. You can see how the queen actually has to carry his weight, and it doesn't take him very long at all once he gets into position. And there he goes, while his buddies are all watching. Hey, what happened to Joe there? Joe is fallen to the ground. Perhaps he's got a little smile on his mandibles, and the others are going to take their turns. If you haven't seen that movie, it's got some amazing footage in it. When you consider the number of drones to bees, what are the odds for any particular drone being able to successfully mate? A colony may be anywhere from 5 to 20% drones, and there's very few queens produced every year. That doesn't stop the drones from trying. Multiple matings are good for colony fitness, and they're happy to participate in that. But an individual drone probably has between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000% chance of successfully mating. So if one queen mates with 15 drones out of 5,000 in a drone congregation area, that's still pretty low odds. So that's like playing the lottery. But for those few drones, I guess it makes all the difference. But for the rest of them, they're not going to have a whole lot of stories to tell. But as we discussed, multiple matings increase drone chances for success just a little bit. But each time that another drone mates with a queen, then that lowers the proportion of each individual drone's own genes that get passed on. If he's the only drone to mate with a queen, then of course he's the father of 100% of her offspring. And he actually carries enough sperm to completely fertilize a queen, but she will usually go through multiple matings anyway. So each time that another drone mates with the queen, that lowers the proportion that each drone contributes. And it turns out that there is a chemical. This was some recent research that came out. There's a chemical in the seminal fluid of the drones that causes blindness in queen honeybees. It's only temporary, but there's a toxic protein that affects the queen's vision for about 24 to 48 hours after insemination. And this discourages the queen from taking more mating flights because she can't see very well in order to orient on her hive location and on the horizon to make it out and back. So multiple matings are good for the colony, but not for the individual drone. So this makes it less likely that queens will keep making mating flights, and it improves the proportion of offsprings that are fathered by any individual drones. The paper did not suggest that this had anything to do with the lowering the success rate of queens to return to the hive. So presumably it would not take effect immediately. It gives the queen enough time to get back to the hive, but may discourage her from taking more flights right away. But thought that was an interesting bit of trivia. Do you guys rear your own queens? A lot of beekeepers do. Sometimes we do it without even knowing it, but many of us do it on purpose. If you do, consider being generous to your neighbors, selfishly generous. Give away good queens to all your nearest neighbors, or at least those who maintain hives around your mating yards, within a mile or so of your mating yards. And this will allow your neighbors to produce good quality drones. Of course, you want those drones to not be the same genetic line as the queens you're trying to produce. So maintain multiple hives, but those in your drone lines, you can raise some queens and you can give those away, and you can improve the gene pool in the neighborhood around your particular hives. And that way your neighbors are helping you to raise better queens. And that works out well for everyone. And of course, your neighbors will think that you're wonderfully generous for giving them all of these queens. And they won't know what your real motivation is. So appreciate your drones. They're working just as hard as worker bees. They don't produce any honey, but they are contributing a wonderful amount of effort to the continuation of our beehives. Thank you all very much. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you,
Thank
Jon.
you, Jon.
Oh, we have
Lots.
And I do have
Hey, Jon.
a number of references. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to provide those to you where I came up with all of this information.
Good grief. It's too many references.
Well, I'm trying to overwhelm you with the scope of my knowledge here, which is
so we
really
won't
just
ask
taken
questions,
from everyone
right?
else. Exactly. So you can't blame me. I got all this from someone else.
All right, I've got a
That's how
question
science
for you.
works. Okay.
I read Koeniger and Koeniger's book, and I just can't buy. I just don't buy it. It doesn't make sense to me. This, diminishing horizons and all that. It's kind of weird. But on a flat plain, okay, you got bees out in Nebraska, say, or Kansas, where they're really, and presumably the drones are kind of scattered around, right? And the drone congregation areas are much looser. So have there ever been any studies about how well queens in such landscapes mate? Do they not mate with as many drones because the DCAs are not as densely packed with drones?
That comment that I made that the drones are more evenly distributed, that actually came directly from the Koeniger's book. Page 64, I believe, if you want to look that up. And I would imagine that even in an area where the drones are kind of spread out, once they detect queen pheromone, and of course we know that bees are very attuned to specific odors, they kind of all rush over to that area. It may be a factor of you have to be upwind or downwind of another bee in order to get that benefit. But remember, a queen only has to mate a few times. So there's thousands of drones out there. She doesn't have to encounter 10,000 at once like a drone congregation area, but she can still more than likely find several of them over the course of the few days that she'd be looking. I don't think that we have answered all the questions about drone congregation areas. There's a lot of research that can still be done. They're still kind of mysterious, but the whole diminishing horizons and things like that make as much sense as anything else I was able to read. I know that people lately have been using drones to study drones, like the little drone quadcopters with cameras on them, and you can attach pheromones or virgin queens in cages and hang down, and you can film things as you fly along, and people are locating drone congregation areas that way. In the past, they did that with what's called drone fishing. Basically, you get a great big balloon, a weather balloon or a big helium balloon on a fishing pole, and you walk around and you can use the fishing reel to raise and lower it at different altitudes and try to spot the drones that are congregating in specific places. They do have very specific borders in a lot of cases, and if you walk outside of a certain boundary, the drones seem to ignore them. And then when you walk into that area, they're said to just all rush right over to that queen. So there is something to this congregation area. There's something attractive about certain areas more than others, and nobody's completely sure exactly what they all are, but I'd be interested in learning more about them myself if I had time to do that. Maybe we can sit down and design some experiments together, Landy. Did I lose y'all? Anybody there? Hello?
I had lost the mic.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I plan to use some of your fun facts in one of my presentations. So
Great.
my question is, since there are full sisters and half sisters among the worker bees, can they recognize each other, and do they treat each other differently depending on whether they are children of the same drones or not?
You know, there was a bunch of research that was done in the late 1980s that kind of explored that. And I think Kirk Vischer and some other people tried to look at that. And they determined that bees could recognize that relationship, whether they were super sisters or just half sisters. And some people suggested that they were more likely to rear a larva to a queen if they were full sisters. They were more likely to care for them. And when times get tough and it's time to, if they have to cull out some brood because they're nutritionally stressed and there's no food, they have to get rid of some larvae, then they specifically go after ones that they're not quite so related to. But more recently, I think some other people have started to question that, and I'm really not up on that research, but I think you could make a case either way for that. If you'd like, I have some papers back at my office. If you really are interested in that, I'd be happy to send you some references. But it wasn't really part of what we were talking about tonight.
Oh, excellent, John. We have Charlie.
And I believe that video that I have on YouTube on haplodiploidy sex determination, it delves into that a little bit. So if you want to watch that video, then it does touch on that. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead. You may have turned your microphone off again. Hello? Hello? Not sure if I lost y'all.
Don't worry. Can you hear us now?
I can hear you now. Now I don't hear anything. Okay. Oh, you were there and I lost you.
John, we'll let you go due to mic problems, but thank you.
Well, I'm happy to share. Thank you all very much for the invitation. Have a good night.